only just begun.
So please welcome Richard and Martin to the stage.
Martin.
Richard and Martin. It's not Richard and Judy, it's Richard and Martin.
Martin, good morning.
Good
and welcome
morning,
back
Richard.
after the 10th edition.
Too long.
Let's start with a big picture question. You're more than anybody else, I guess, in our sector. You kind of represent us at some pretty interesting tables with government, industrialists, finance around the world. What are the big macro?
Not so interesting, actually.
Oh, really?
And not so prevalent as people's imagination.
Oh,
right.
Okay.
We try.
What are the big picture issues? What are the big macro issues that are coming towards us?
Well, what's happened, I think, in the last few months, and it is literally the last few months, is the so-called geopolitical issues have come to the fore. So clients in this room and outside, I think are preoccupied. I think too preoccupied, but that's, coming from whence I come, I would say that, with these geopolitical things. So I would say 10 weeks ago, it was the Ukraine. I went to International Business Council, the World Economic Forum, at the end of August in Geneva, and a lot of German companies there, and because Germany is the biggest trading partner with Russia and vice versa, they were very preoccupied with Ukraine. But then the focus shifted to Hong Kong and the demonstrations in Hong Kong, and people become worried about China, and they're worried about China because China is the engine of worldwide economic growth. It's still, according to Group M, for example, this year would provide about a third of the growth in the media marketplaces, whether you're talking about online or offline. So that would be, I think, the euro. Can Draghi, with about a QE, get Western continental Europe out of the doldrums? ISIS or Daesh in the Middle East, and the whole situation surrounding the Middle East, whether you're talking about Egypt, the situation seems a little bit better there with Sisi. So the whole of the Middle Eastern issues, obviously Syria and what's going on more generally in the region is of great concern. The BRIC markets, which were the virtuous markets, have not become vice-like, but they've certainly, many companies that have had predominant positions or dominant positions in the fast growth markets, because those fast growth markets have slowed, but they're still growing faster than the slow growth markets, if you get my drift. Those companies that had strong positions are not as fashionable as they were before. I think longer term, it's the right way to go, but we're following that route. So Brazil, in addition to Russia, becomes an issue. We're in the midst of an election in Brazil. We were actually there having a board meeting in Rio on the night of the election on the 26th, on the 5th of October. The second round is the 26th. If Neves unseats Dilma, probably the prospects for the economy from the private sector point of view are improved. Not dissimilar to what you saw with Modi in the election in India, where there's high levels of expectation, and the question now is whether Modi can deliver on his promises, having taken New York by storm around the UN conference a few days ago. So you put that little sort of cocktail of things together, it means that geopolitically people are very uncertain. Companies are sitting on $4.2 trillion of net cash with relatively unleveraged balance sheets. The Pavlovian reaction to all this is to sort of sit there and delay.
Uncertainty.
And that's not good. Uncertainty is bad, and it's bad for our industry, because people are unwilling to commit. I mean, the interesting thing is you talk to somebody like Mark Carney at the Bank of England, they don't see great liveliness, even in an economy like the UK that's growing at around 3.5%, 4%, they don't see great liveliness in CapEx or indeed OpEx. And we would be classified as operating expenditure. We think it's an investment, not a cost, obviously, but that OpEx you can vary. I think marketing spend actually is the investment that clients should be making in slow growth Western European markets where they're trying to contract capacity or just keep capacity constant. The market share battle becomes more important. And in those fast growth markets where you're expanding your capacity, putting money behind that expansion in capacity is equally important. So I think we are the solution to a lot of the pressure that the companies see. But Jeremy Bullmore has put this over many, many years. Jeremy used to be chairman of JWT, still on WPP's advisory board, and he said for years that at least until you get to 100% market share, it's unlimited what you can do on growing the top line, but there's a finite limit to what you can do on costs.
Yeah. So in this context of uncertainty and the change we've seen in the last 10 years since our first engage, you actually had just come back from China and spoke about China at that conference. You talked about digital, and you said it's happening now, and it's strong, and it's rapid, and you need to get involved. And since then, you kind of called it in technology.
Yes.
You called it in content, kind of interesting WPP brands in content. So as this media market is kind of expanding into entertainment and commerce and so on, you're going with it. I mean, are you betting on all horses?
Well, in a sense, nothing's new. I mean, when I was at Saatchi in the 60s and the 70s, I remember that Compton Advertising that we did a deal with used to produce the world that terms soap operas. They produce content actually in the offices of Saatchi in New York. I don't think they do that any longer. But soap operas, were the forerunner of what we see in terms of online content development. No, I think there are two big things that we've seen in the last couple of years. One is obviously the growth of Xaxis, so-called programmatic, although we don't call it that, because there are layers of technology and data built into this that are critically important. So our recently strengthened relationship with AppNexus, which is the technology backbone to the Xaxis platform, and maybe we'll talk a little bit more about that. That's one area. Now, that's running at about $750 million, $800 million of billing for us out of a total media book, according to RECMA, of $105 billion. Our reported billings last year, and we're the only agency group that actually publishes its billings, but the audited billings was about $75 billion. So it's small in the context of everything, but growing very rapidly. We're in 33 countries already with the Xaxis platform. At Nexus, we're not a technology company. We don't develop technology, we apply technology. So having relationships with AppNexus, or having another good example of Rentrack, the deal that we've done with Rentrack between most importantly, everybody should understand this, the two parts of our company that did the deal with Rentrack were Group M and what we call Kantar, which is our data investment management business. We changed the name of our market research business to Consumer Insight and then to Media Investment Management. And maybe people believe that as being sort of superficial and flip. It's not. The reason we call it, the acronym is DIM, which is not the best acronym in the world, but the reason we're bringing MIM and DIM together is we think that those two parts of our business are critically interlinked. And what's interesting is in the last few weeks, we've had significant new business success, particularly in the media area, by making the DIM offer an integral part of the MIM offer. And that some of the stuff that I'm talking about has not been publicly announced, but shortly will. And there's clearly a differentiation that we're starting to develop. And differentiation in our business is critically important. So that whole area of programmatic, technology, data is critically important. That's one. The second area is content.
Right.
And Group M Entertainment, when I said to Mark Sweeney last night at the NABS event that we're the largest commissioner of content, he stared in disbelief. But you've only got to go to Richard Desmond's speech last year at Cambridge to get evidence of that. And so we've become in the UK, Group M Entertainment, the most significant commissioner of entertainment and content. That is also another important area, and that's what's driven our investment in Vice, in Media Rights Capital, in indigenous media. What we did yesterday with Time Warner and Ratpac in China, with Rugang Li, who sits on our board and is chairman of Shanghai Media Group. So content and, let's call it, data and media are critically important, I think, for our future. So if I live long enough to be invited back to IAB in 10 years' time or whatever it is, that, I think, those two things will be very important.
Clients, in my experience, find all this kind of hyperactivity quite challenging, as well as kind of keeping up with it.
We do too.
Well, so what are the tips? What are the tips for the clients? So how do you kind of ride this wave without getting swamped by it?
I mean, I think the honest thing is, the honest answer is it's very difficult.
Yeah.
And we are bumping around in the dark. Now, there are two things going on. One is geographic, and we can figure that out. You know, we're in 111 markets, the last one being Mongolia. It could have been 112. We could have added Scotland, but that didn't happen. But who knows what may happen in the future. So the geographic stuff, you can, you know, I'm going to attend a conference this morning, somewhat controversial, on Iran. And obviously there are very, very important conditions to Iran's entry into the West or into the economic world, or the lifting of sanctions, the recognition of Israel. All those things are critically important. But you can sort of follow that. It might be controversial, but you can follow that. You can get that. Myanmar, sanctions are lifted, 60 million people. Vietnam, job back many years ago. Cuba is a possibility. You know, Vietnam's 80 million people, roughly the same size as Iran. You can get that stuff. Mongolia, you can get that stuff. Scotland, you can get it. That's relatively easy. Complicated, but relatively easy. The other side, the technology side, is frightening. I'm not an engineer. Many of the people in this area are engineers and understand it far better. So we are bumping along in the dark. Now, yesterday I was in Scotland and the day before in Brussels, and Eric Schmidt gave a speech as he tries to renegotiate Google's agreement that they had with Almunia, it seemed, but now with the new Danish competition commissioner going to have to renegotiate it. And he was asked, you know, in his speech, he said, you know, what's the greatest threat to Google? And he said Amazon. But then he checked himself and said it's not Amazon. He said exactly what Nikesh Arora said at our Stream conference in Cannes. It's the garage startup. Why? Because that's where Google was 10, 15 years ago, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Same thing with us. I mean, it pays to be paranoid, as Andy Grove said many, many years ago. And I think you have to be paranoid in this area because you just don't know what is going to happen. I mean, you just saw in the presentation just before the rapid changes, not just in terms of consumer behavior, but in the structural environment in which you operate in. You know, I don't think Amazon and Google are the two big gorillas in the room, elephants in the room. But there are other elephants. The biggest elephant, I think, is Alibaba. I mean, I think that we in the West, and I've said this, you can go back 4 or 5 years ago, the development of Chinese technology, you know, we say the Chinese copy, they steal. Think again. We said exactly the same thing. My father was in the radio and electrical business. It was said about the Hong Kong Chinese. It was said about the Japanese. It was said about the South Koreans. If they do steal, if they do copy at the beginning, they certainly get themselves to a stage where they don't. And again, on Monday when I was in Brussels, I turned on CNBC and there was Apple complaining about Xiaomi's statistics in India as it launched its phone in India. In China, Xiaomi, 3 years old, is already ahead of Samsung and Apple in the smartphone market. Right. Hires Hugo Barra. Hugo Barra is responsible for taking it into India and other countries. And Hugo, same day Monday, announced he was hiring another ex-Googler in India to develop the Xiaomi phone, the handset, internet-delivered handset, I think. So watch out. The Chinese are coming. And it's not just, you know, traditional companies that we all know about like Huawei or indeed Alibaba. There are others coming behind it like Xiaomi and others that are going to be very significant players. And the other final thing is Alibaba is a 200 billion market cap company. It's bigger than Facebook in market cap. It's half the size of Google. And then you've got others behind it. You know, Robin Lee at Baidu, last time I checked, was 60 billion. I think Tencent's 140 billion of market cap. These are powerful companies on a world stage. And just don't think, you know, Peter Thiel said in an interview, you know, they're protected by the Chinese state. True. And, you know, Jack Ma and Alibaba depends very heavily on the approval of the Chinese state. But don't underestimate their ability and dedication to moving the model outside China to other markets.
So Google, frenemy, foe, are they more a friend than an enemy these days?
They're a friendlier friend. We just had a business review with them 2 days ago with Matt Britton and his colleagues, and we will hit about $3 billion with them this year, this calendar year. We've done well over $2 billion in the first 9 months of the year. The big growth is coming from mobile search and video, YouTube, particularly interestingly in high penetration TV markets. So in markets like Brazil and Italy, where consumers are, or indeed India, where consumers are very committed to television in its traditional forms, and indeed in its new forms, we're seeing big expansion of video. Now, we would invest with Globo in Brazil, for example, let's use that, about $1 billion a year. Our Google relationship has doubled to over $100 million, but it's still a tenth of the size of Globo, which controls about 70% of TV and media in Brazil. So there's a long way for the new media to go, but it's coming, and the balance is shifting. The biggest, so Google is a friendlier frenemy or a friendlier fro than it was, but there is still a residual concern in agencies, and I think very interestingly, increasingly amongst clients, as to Google's power. The dominance of Google, which Matthias Dörpfner drew attention to in his article in Frankfurt Allgemeine, which I think actually, he wrote it, 6 months ago or whatever, I think actually that ground to a halt. That was the event that ground to a halt in negotiations with the EU. The two big threats to Google, if there are any threats, are one, size brings its problems. The bigger you get, the tougher it gets. And the second thing is the regulator. I think the regulation issue, and remember they're not in China. Well, they are in China because the Android platform is dominant in China. People forget that. Mm-hmm. But they're not there in their classic forms. Right. And they probably can't get back into China given the two founders' view about ethical view about China.
Well, Eileen's on next. She'll perhaps have something to say about it. We're pretty much out of time, so right. I just want to ask you a personal question, if I may. So
you can ask any question, like whether I answer it. And I
understand the rules. Right. So WPP is 30 years old next year. Running an agency business is tough. You have clients going, coming. You have talent coming and going.
Seething mass of humanity.
A seething mass of humanity in 111 countries. It's brutal. You still enjoy it?
Well, I've never regarded it, Richard, as being brutal in that sense. I mean, I always, when people ask me questions of that sort of genre, I go back to Bill Shankly's quote, football is not a matter of life and death, it's more important than that. And WPP is not a matter of life and death, it's more important than that. This is not a job. And many times I don't get the balance right between WPP, my family, and society, the three sort of great areas you have to focus on, and it gets out of balance. But I would say that, it is tough, it is very demanding, but I choose to do it. This is not something, I'm going to say it's fun. Sometimes it can get, I don't believe there's stress. I think you're just not having fun. And it's really interesting. I mean, the interesting thing about the question is, whilst it is tough, it is more interesting today than it's ever been. Yeah. Right? So the complexity, whether it's geographic complexity or technological complexity, is so interesting. And coming back to the question about what should you do in a complex environment, is you should experiment. Easy for me to say, but you should experiment. So let's just take AppNexus, and hopefully we'll have a trifecta of things. AppNexus, let's take that, Rentrack, and maybe there's something else we'll do. What have we done there? Really interesting. We've taken a small part of our business, OAS, out of Xaxis, and inserted it into AppNexus. We've taken a small part of Kantar, the US measurement assets, only $8 million, $9 million, and inserted it into Rentrack. And we've injected some cash. We haven't gone out and paid a phenomenal valuation for either of those companies. We've built a trading relationship with them. We're not a technology company. They are the technology companies. We've applied the technology. And I think that makes it really interesting. So at one level, it's brutal, as you say. It's tough, and it's very demanding. And the rise of finance and procurement, particularly post-Lehman And this inexorable focus on cost makes it tough, and slow growth in the world makes it tough. And then, by the way, that's unlikely to change in my view. So it's going to get tougher. The screw is going to tighten. But when the screw tightens, even if an economy is flat, there's going to be parts of it that are growing at 10% and parts of it declining at 10%. You can find stuff to do that will give you the growth that you need. So I think it's brutal, it's challenging, but it's really, really interesting. And as long as people let me continue to do it, I'll continue to do it.
And come back again before 10 years.
Whenever.
Martin Sorrell, thank
Thanks
you very much.
indeed.
Well done. Thank you.
We've only just begun.